There are generals who win wars. There are generals who lose wars. And then there are generals who, by sheer force of will, refuse to let a war be lost, even when everything around them is collapsing. Men who stand in the path of disaster and hold the line through nothing but iron determination, personal courage, and a tactical mind that functions at its highest level, precisely when the situation is at its most desperate. Walter Model was one of those generals. He was not a Nazi ideologue. He was not a political soldier. He was a professional military man to his core, a man who believed in discipline, in aggressive action, and in the absolute refusal to accept defeat. Adolf Hitler called him his best defensive general. His own soldiers called him the Fireman of the Eastern Front, because wherever the front was burning, wherever a catastrophe was unfolding, Model was the man sent in to put out the fire. He stopped Soviet offensives that should have shattered the German line. He turned retreats into organized defensive walls. He outmaneuvered Allied commanders who had vastly superior resources. And when the war was finally, irreversibly lost, he made a final decision entirely consistent with the way he had lived his entire life, on his own terms, answering to no one. This is the story of Walter Model, the Wehrmacht's last true miracle worker. Walter Model was born in January 1891 in Genten, a small town in the Prussian province of Saxony. He came from a modest, middle-class family with no particular military tradition. His father was a music teacher. There was nothing in his background that obviously pointed toward a career as one of Germany's most feared and respected military commanders. But from a young age, Model showed an intense drive and a fierce competitive spirit that set him apart. He decided early that he wanted a military career, and he pursued it with the same relentless determination that would later define his leadership on the battlefield. He entered the Imperial German Army as an officer cadet in 1909 and was commissioned as a lieutenant in 1910. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Model was a young infantry officer on the Western Front. He served throughout the war, was wounded multiple times, and demonstrated a consistent pattern of personal bravery combined with sharp tactical thinking. By the end of the war in 1918, he had risen to professional army that Germany was permitted to maintain under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, limited to just 100,000 men. Being selected for the Reichswehr was highly competitive, and only the best officers were retained. Model spent the interwar years studying military theory, attending staff college, and steadily advancing through the ranks. He became a serious student of modern warfare, particularly interested in the emerging concepts of armored warfare and combined arms operations that would define the Second World War. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933 and began the rapid expansion of the German military, Model was already a senior officer with decades of professional experience. He was not a Nazi enthusiast. He joined the Nazi Party, as virtually all senior officers eventually did, but his relationship with the political leadership was always defined by tension rather than devotion. Model was interested in military effectiveness, not ideology. He was famously blunt, famously aggressive, and famously unwilling to tell his superiors what they wanted to hear if what they wanted to hear was wrong. These qualities would both define his career and, on multiple occasions, nearly end it. When Germany went to war in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland, Model was a divisional commander. He performed well in Poland and even better during the stunning invasion of France in May 1940, where his division played a key role in the breakthrough that collapsed the Allied defensive line. By the time France fell in June 1940, Model had established himself as one of the most aggressive and capable divisional commanders in the German army. He was promoted and given command of an armored corps. The real test came with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which began in June 1941. The opening months of Barbarossa produced stunning German victories, with entire Soviet armies encircled and destroyed in massive battles of encirclement. Model's armored corps participated in these operations, driving deep into Soviet territory with the speed and aggression that had become his trademark. But as the summer of 1941 bled into autumn, and autumn into the catastrophic Russian winter, the German advance ground to a halt in front of Moscow. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was the first true crisis of the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht had been designed for a short, decisive campaign, not for a prolonged winter war in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees. Soviet forces launched massive counterattacks, and in several places the German line came close to breaking completely. It was during this crisis that Walter Model first demonstrated the quality that would make him legendary. In January 1942, his Ninth Army was in danger of being completely encircled by Soviet forces near Rzhev. The situation was desperate. Other commanders were requesting permission to retreat. Model refused. He flew to Hitler's headquarters, demanded the resources he needed, argued his case with a bluntness that astonished everyone in the room, got what he wanted, and flew back to his army. Then he stabilized the line through sheer force of will, personally appearing at the most threatened points of the front, relieving officers who showed hesitation, and driving his men to hold positions that seemed utterly untenable. The line held. This performance at Rzhev established a pattern that would repeat itself again and again across the Eastern Front over the next 2 years. Whenever a sector of the front collapsed, whenever a Soviet offensive threatened to break through and roll up entire German army groups, Hitler sent Model. He became the Wehrmacht's designated crisis manager, the general you called when you had run out of options. His methods were not subtle. He was demanding, ruthless with officers he considered incompetent, and completely indifferent to his own personal safety. He was frequently seen at the very front line, under direct fire, assessing the situation himself rather than relying on reports from the rear. His soldiers respected him enormously for this, even as they feared his volcanic temper and his absolute intolerance for excuses. One of the most remarkable aspects of Model's career was his relationship with Adolf Hitler. Most German generals who disagreed with Hitler either kept quiet, were dismissed, or ended up implicated in resistance plots. Model did none of these things. He disagreed with Hitler openly, argued with him directly, and somehow continued to receive commands and promotions. There are multiple documented accounts of Model standing in the map room at Hitler's headquarters, pointing at a military situation and telling the Führer bluntly that his orders were wrong and that Model intended to do something different. On at least one occasion, when Hitler demanded to know by what authority Model was countermanding his orders, Model reportedly replied that he was doing so on his own authority as the commander responsible for the situation. Remarkably, Hitler tolerated this in a way he tolerated it from almost no one else, because Model kept delivering results. By 1944, the strategic situation for Germany had become catastrophic. In the east, the massive Soviet Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 destroyed Army Group Center. one of the largest single military disasters in the history of warfare, with entire German armies effectively ceasing to exist. Once again, Model was sent to stabilize the chaos. He was given command of Army Group Center in the middle of the collapse and somehow managed to construct a new defensive line out of the shattered remnants of destroyed divisions, preventing the complete disintegration of the German position in the east. But it was in the west where Model achieved what many military historians consider his greatest single operational success. In September 1944, the Allied forces that had broken out of Normandy were advancing rapidly into the Netherlands. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery conceived an enormously ambitious plan, Operation Market Garden, to use the largest airborne assault in history to seize a series of bridges across the major rivers of the Netherlands, culminating with the bridge at Arnhem over the Rhine. If successful, it would outflank the entire German defensive line and potentially end the war by Christmas 1944. By extraordinary coincidence, Walter Model had his headquarters just outside Arnhem when the Allied paratroopers began landing around him on the 17th of September 1944. Rather than panicking or fleeing, Model immediately grasped what was happening and took personal control of the German response. He had 2 SS Panzer divisions resting and refitting in the area, a fact that Allied intelligence had failed to properly account for. Model threw them directly at the Allied paratroopers before they could consolidate their positions. The fighting around Arnhem became one of the most ferocious battles of the entire Northwest European campaign. The British 1st Airborne Division, one of the finest units in the Allied order of battle, was virtually destroyed. Operation Market Garden failed. The Rhine crossing that Montgomery had hoped would end the war was denied. Walter Model, reacting with instinctive speed and tactical brilliance to a crisis that had literally landed in his backyard, had stopped the operation cold. By early 1945, however, even Model's extraordinary abilities could no longer alter the fundamental reality of the war. Germany was being crushed from east and west simultaneously, and the Wehrmacht was running out of men, equipment, fuel, and time. In February and March 1945, American forces crossed the Rhine and encircled the entire German Army Group B, which Model commanded, in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers were trapped. American forces tightened the noose, and on the 17th of April, 1945, Army Group B formally ceased to exist as a fighting force. Model refused to surrender. He could not bring himself to march his men into captivity, and he refused to be captured himself. He knew that the Soviets had already issued an indictment against him for war crimes related to his operations on the Eastern Front, and he had no illusions about what awaited him in Soviet captivity. But he also could not face the idea of a formal surrender, of handing over his sword to the enemy. On the 21st of April 1945, Walter Model walked alone into a forest near Duisburg, in the Ruhr region of Germany. He drew his pistol, and he shot himself. He was 54 years old. His body was buried in secret by a small group of officers who had been with him. It was not found and properly identified until years after the war. Field Marshal Walter Model left behind a legacy that historians have debated ever since. He was not a war criminal in the manner of the SS commanders who ran the concentration camps, but he operated within a criminal system, and his operations on the Eastern Front, particularly the brutal anti-partisan warfare and the treatment of civilian populations in occupied territories, involved actions that, in a different world, might have brought him before a tribunal. He was a man of extraordinary military talent who placed that talent entirely at the service of a regime that was perpetrating the greatest crimes in human history. His soldiers mourned him. Some of the American commanders who had faced him across the front lines acknowledged his ability with genuine respect. And Adolf Hitler, when he was informed of Model's death in the final days of the Third Reich, reportedly said that Model had been his best commander. Whether that assessment is a compliment or a condemnation depends entirely on your perspective. What is beyond dispute is that Walter Model was one of the most remarkable military figures of the Second World War. A man who held the line longer than anyone had a right to expect, who refused to accept the impossible, and who, in the end, chose death over surrender. That is his story, and now you know it. And